say October is the month for fear, the grand stage, the costumes, the playful shadows. But I've lived enough years, seen enough things disappear into the rearview mirror of my big rig, or get swallowed by the soil on a late autumn night, to tell you the truth. October is a lie. November. November is when the harvest of the soul truly begins. Fear isn't a flash in the pan, a cheap jump scare you shake off with candy corn and a laugh. Real fear is a slow decay. It's the sound your breath makes when the thermometer drops below freezing and you realize you're entirely alone. It's the way the light dies before 5 p.m., taking all the familiar edges of the world with it, leaving only vague, hungry shapes. November is the month of the lingering cold of the transition. Everything is muted. The leaves are gone, the ground is hard, and the veil between here and somewhere else doesn't just thin, it frays, like old cloth, opening up holes you can slip right through. This is when the things that were too shy for the blaze of October find their footing. They need the cold, the silence, the sheer, crushing isolation that comes before the first snowfall. I've got 3 stories for you tonight. 3 times the world cracked open and showed me the emptiness underneath. The first is about a simple job, a deep forest, and an entity that uses the absolute absence of sound to hunt. The second, a slow burn, a creeping, psychological dread that took a decent man and stripped him of his sanity, one strange, impossible anomaly at a time. And the last one? That's about a thing I encountered while working the night shift. A piece of the old lore that explains why this month feels so wrong, and the devastating, final consequence of looking too deep into the coming winter's darkness. You're not safe anymore. Not tonight. Not when the cold starts to settle in your bones. Turn up the volume, turn down the lights, and don't look over your shoulder. The transition has begun. Story 1. The Silent Watcher of Copperhead Gorge. I used to drive logging roads, deep into the Appalachians. We're talking forgotten dirt tracks, where your nearest neighbor is a mountain lion, and your only company is the endless static on the radio. This happened late in November, about 15 years back, in a place called Copperhead Gorge. The name should have been my first warning. The job was simple. Retrieve a broken-down skidder, one of those heavy forestry tractors that was stuck a good 10 miles past the main lumber camp. The crew had left it and hiked out when the storm rolled in. Now, the skies were clear, but the temperature was dropping like a stone, cold like a freshly dug grave. I got to the skidder just before sundown. The woods there, they were ancient. The trees were so thick and the canopy so high that even in the middle of the day, it was perpetual dusk. I hooked up the tow cable, tightened the chains, and that's when the absolute silence hit me. You know how a forest is never truly silent? There's always the wind, a bird, the snap of a twig, something. This was a total suffocating absence of noise. Like someone had pulled the plug on the world sound system. My own breath sounded offensively loud. I figured the cold had driven everything into hibernation. Made my skin crawl, though. I climbed back into my pickup, a big old Ford, started the engine, and put it in gear. I'd only gone about 100 yards when I felt a massive thump against the back of the cab. Not a jarring crash, but a heavy, blunt impact, like a sack of concrete dropping onto the metal. I slammed on the brakes. My heart was hammering. I checked the mirrors. Nothing. Just the back of the towed skidder, sitting dead, still in the growing gloom. Just the chains shifting, I told myself. Or a big branch. I eased forward again. Thump. This time I heard a faint, high-pitched screech of metal after the impact, like something scraping. I killed the engine, locked the doors, took the shotgun from its rack under the seat. I rolled down the window just a crack. I waited. The silence came flooding back in, a physical pressure on my eardrums. I was sweating cold. Then I saw it. About 50 yards behind the skidder, a shadow. That's the only way I can describe it. Not a silhouette, not something just dark because of the light, but an entity made of sheer, pitch-black nothingness. It wasn't tall, maybe the height of a grown man bent over, but it was wide. Too wide. Its movements were all wrong. It flowed more than it walked, like oil spilled on glass. It stopped, and that absolute total silence seemed to be coming from it. I watched, frozen. It was facing away from me, towards the skidder. I saw two long, segmented arms reach out, impossibly thin, ending in hands that were less like flesh and more like a bundle of dried sticks. They wrapped around one of the massive tires of the skidder. The metal screeched again, that terrible sound, and the entire skidder, which must have weighed 10 tons, rocked violently sideways. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, wasn't anything with muscles and bones that obey physics. This was something that had force but no weight, a creature of pure, destructive cold. It turned its head. I don't know how I knew it was looking at me. It didn't have eyes. Where a face should be, there was only a smooth, unsettling dome of darkness. But I felt that gaze, the cold probe of something utterly ancient and predatory. Reaching for the sound of my ragged breathing, I yanked the window up, jammed the truck into drive, and stomped the gas. The tires spun. I was towing a mountain of steel. The truck groaned. I glanced in the mirror. The silent watcher was gone. No, wait. It was right there, pressing against the back window of my cab. It hadn't moved. It had appeared. The darkness of its body seemed to press against the glass, making the interior of my cab suddenly drop 10 degrees. I could feel the non-existence of its face inches from my skull. My hair stood on end. It made no sound. It didn't need to. It was the physical embodiment of the silence, a hungry void. My foot was still on the gas, the engine screaming. I remembered the scrape of metal, the thump. It hadn't been hitting the truck. It had been climbing onto the skidder. It was hitching a ride. Then, a miracle. The wheels caught on a patch of loose gravel, and the truck lunged forward. The sudden jerk, the violence of the movement, was enough. I watched in the side mirror as the watcher fell, hitting the dirt road in a strange, floppy heap. The darkness of it seemed to shrink for a second. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I drove that 10 miles out of the gorge like the devil himself was tethered to my bumper. I made it back to the main road, the roar of my tires on the asphalt, a welcome, beautiful sound. But here's the kicker. When I got to the tow yard, the skidder was fine. The chains were tight. But on the back window of my pickup, there were 5 distinct, shallow scratches radiating out from the center, thin as needles. And the metal on the roof of the cab, right above my head, it was dented, not smashed, but slightly concave, as if something impossibly heavy, but made of nothing, had been sitting there, waiting for me to make a sound. I never drove a logging road in November again. I learned that night that the greatest predator doesn't roar or hiss. It needs the cold. It needs the isolation. And it hunts using the sound of your fear. Story 2. The Gardener and the Anomaly. This next story is about my friend Henry. Henry was a gardener, not just a guy who mowed lawns, but a true horticulturalist. He worked at the grandest estate in the county, a sprawling old place that backed right up to the state park. Henry's flaw? He was meticulous, obsessive, almost about order. Everything had its place. The tools, the planting calendar, the very rows of his prize-winning roses. He needed the world to make sense, to follow a predictable pattern. And in November, the garden is a world of decay, a beautiful chaos he always struggled to manage. This all started right after the first serious frost, the kind that blackens the last of the chrysanthemums. Henry was working in the main greenhouse, his little sanctuary. The first anomaly was simple. He was potting up bulbs for the spring, getting the inventory ready. He had a stack of 50 tulip bulbs guaranteed. He counted them into the trays. 10, 20, 30, 49. He counted again. 49. Impossible. He checked the bag. He checked the floor. He scoured the table. There was no dust, no dirt, no sign of the 50th bulb. Now, a normal person shrugs. A gardener curses the nursery. Henry? He spent 4 hours going over his logbooks. He was sure. 50. The small, meaningless disruption of order lodged in his mind like a shard of glass. A few days later, he was trimming the hedge maze, a colossal 20-foot-tall labyrinth of yew. A tedious job, but one he loved because it was all about geometry, about straight lines and perfect angles. He started in the morning, working a long, single stretch. At lunchtime, he paused, looking down the path he'd just trimmed. The line was perfect, laser straight. He came back after lunch. And there, about halfway down his newly trimmed section, was a single branch, freshly grown, or so it seemed, sticking out from the hedge by a good foot. Not a dead branch, not one he missed. A vibrant, green-tipped growth, thick as his arm, that simply wasn't there an hour ago. Henry swore he felt his stomach turn over. He didn't just trim it, he sawed it off right at the trunk, his hands shaking. The line was perfect again. He walked back to his shed, the offensive branch under his arm. He tossed it into the compost pile, but when he walked back to the maze to start the next section, his eyes were drawn to the clean line he'd made, and there it was again, another branch, in the exact same spot as the one he'd just cut. Not a regrown branch. It was too big. It was a perfect, identical, illogical replacement. This is where the psychological dread set in. It wasn't menacing. It was defiant. It was the garden itself telling Henry his control was an illusion. Over the next week, the anomalies escalated, twisting his meticulous world into a nightmare of wrongness. He'd line up his trowels by size on the pegboard. The next morning, one would be turned the other way, handle in, a silent protest to his order. He planted a row of perennial seeds in the test bed. Red, blue, yellow, a perfect color block. 2 days later, a single black-petaled flower, unlike anything he'd ever seen, was blooming violently in the middle of the red section. It was the wrong species, the wrong color, the wrong time of year. The ultimate blow came on a Tuesday. Henry was watering the orchid house. The air was warm, humid, everything in its place. He looked at his favorite plant, a rare Dracula simia, a species whose tiny blooms look exactly like the face of a little monkey. He had documented it in its pre-bloom state. He got closer, misting the air. The tiny flower bud was splitting open, but as it unfurled, it wasn't a monkey face. It was something else. It was a face, yes, but it was human. A miniature, sickly pale, perfect human face, with wide, terrified eyes and a tiny, open mouth. It was frozen in a silent, agonizing scream, its petals forming the wrinkled skin and hair. Henry didn't scream. He didn't run. He stood there, his mind scrambling for a logical place to put this data. It's a mutation. It's a trick of the light. But the face was crying. Tiny, clear droplets of water were welling up in the corners of its minuscule eyes and running down the petal cheeks. The sinking mental collapse was swift and total. His need for order was so great that when the universe presented him with undeniable, reproducible chaos, a plant that screams, a hedge that defies pruning, a disappearing number his brain simply short-circuited, he reached out a trembling hand, not to destroy it, but to touch the tiny, screaming orchid face, to feel the texture of the wrongness. That's when I found him. I'd come over to drop off a new tool. He was in the orchid house, sitting on the dirt floor, rocking back and forth. The air was thick and sweet with the smell of decay, though all the plants looked fine. He looked up at me, his eyes huge and unfocused. He wasn't crying, but his lips were moving. "It won't be counted," he whispered, his voice thin as a thread. "It won't be counted. The zero, the negative one. It's planting itself back into the inventory. The line is alive, and it keeps growing where it shouldn't. I cut it. I tried to make it right, but it won't stay cut. I can't tell which part of the world is true anymore." I looked at the orchid stand. The Dracula simia was there. Its bloom was a perfectly normal, albeit strange, tiny monkey face. The hedge maze outside? I walked it on my way out. The lines were impeccable. Henry was institutionalized that same week. He sits in a room now, staring at the perfectly tiled floor. He won't speak, but if you look closely, he's always tracing lines with his finger, over and over, trying to find the one invisible, defiant tile that isn't where it's supposed to be, trying to impose order on a mind the November transition had broken. Story 3. The Night Road Eater. I mentioned I was a truck driver. This last story happened on a lonely stretch of I-80, far out in the Midwest, in the absolute dead heart of November. The kind of place where the moon is your only company and the white lines on the road are the only thing keeping you tethered to reality. This is where I learned the lore of the things that thrive in the cold transition. It all started with the fog. Not just a patch of mist, but a rolling, thick, yellowish-gray curtain that settled over the highway like a blanket of asbestos. It was almost midnight. I was hauling a shipment of frozen beef, a heavy load, a crucial run. My radio, the CB, it started to buzz. Not static, but a low, guttural hum. Then, a voice. A woman's voice, raspy, like dry leaves scraping together. "Driver, you carrying too much weight." I grabbed the mic. "Breaker 1 to 9, who's that?" "This is Papa Bear. You're coming in strange. You carrying the weight of the long dark. The meat is heavy, but the hour is heavier." Then she laughed. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of dry ice cracking. I tried to change the channel, but the voice followed me, always on the same frequency. That's when I noticed it in the rearview mirror. Way back, at the edge of the fog, there was a light. Not a car's headlight, not a lamp, but a single, pulsing red glow. It seemed to bob and weave, moving too fast to be another semi. It was catching up, and it was staying precisely in the center of the lane behind me. I pushed the Cummins engine hard, 80 miles an hour, 85. The truck shuddered, and the red glow, it kept the exact same distance. I remembered a piece of old, forgotten lore a Cree mechanic once told me, one late November night over coffee. When the world is quiet and the highway is the only path, the night road eater comes. It's not a ghost. It's the original hunger of the land, before the road cut through it. It doesn't want your life. It wants your burden. The burden, the weight, the things we carry, physical, mental, spiritual. I looked at the dashboard. My fuel gauge was dropping rapidly, far too fast. The air pressure in my tires was plummeting. The cargo refrigeration unit started to whine, then choke, then die completely. The consequence of the eater's presence wasn't a crash. It was hemorrhage. It was draining my resources. It was consuming the effort of my journey. I felt the truck getting sluggish, heavier, as if the night road eater wasn't just following me, but was somehow physically siphoning the energy out of the vehicle itself. The red light behind me pulsed faster, bigger. Give it up, driver. Let the weight fall. You'll be lighter for the journey. The woman's voice was now a screech in the CB. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I stopped, if I let the truck die and climbed out, the eater would latch onto me. It would drain the weight of my memory, the weight of my hope, the very gravity of my soul, until there was nothing left but an empty shell by the side of the road. I looked down at the dash. The engine temperature was spiking. The oil light was on. I was less than 10 miles from the next rest stop. I couldn't make it. I did the only thing I could think of. I was hauling frozen beef, hundreds of pounds of hard, heavy slabs of meat strapped tight in the trailer. I reached for the emergency release lever for the trailer's tailgate. This was insane. It could cause a catastrophic accident. But what was behind me was worse than any accident. I counted to 3, slammed the air brakes hard enough to rattle my teeth, and yanked the lever. The airlock hissed. The rear gate flew open. I threw the truck into the lowest gear and mashed the gas pedal again. I looked in the side mirror. In the billowing yellow fog, the single red light stopped dead. And then, from my open trailer, I saw a cascade of heavy, blood-red slabs of frozen beef sliding out and hitting the asphalt with sickening, blunt impacts. The eater wasn't after me. It was after the effort of the work, the mass of the cargo, the burden. The red light seemed to lunge at the fallen meat. It didn't stop to examine it. It just consumed the scene, the frozen beef, the road surface. The fog itself seemed to wrap and contract around the dropped cargo. The red glow intensified into a brief, blinding flash. Then, utter darkness. The fog was gone. The road was clear. The CB was silent, filled only with clean static. I drove the rest of the way to the rest stop on fumes and sheer adrenaline. I pulled into the lot, killed the engine, and nearly fell out of the cab. The trailer? The gate was wide open. The floor was scraped clean, not a speck of blood or fat, like it had been licked by a giant, sterile tongue. The inventory loss report the next day listed the missing cargo as consumed by unknown force, total loss, 0 salvage. The night road eater taught me that the transition of November isn't just about the darkness. It's about the things that come to collect the weight, the burden, the effort of everything that came before. And when the cold sets in, and the road is lonely, it's best to be carrying nothing at all. Because whatever you've worked for, whatever you're hauling, in the end it will all feed the lore. So, there you have it. The silent hunter in the woods, the chaos that broke a man's ordered world, and the eater on the long road, collecting the toll of the transition. We are all carrying something. And as the November cold sinks its teeth in deeper, remember this: the things that watch from the shadows don't always want your blood. Sometimes they just want the effort it took to get here. They want your sanity, your sense of safety, the beautiful, predictable order of your life. The world is shifting. The cold is a lie. The darkness is the truth. If any of these stories stirred something deep inside you, if that lingering cold feels a little too real tonight, do me a favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, turn on the bell notification, because the darkness is coming, and you need a voice to guide you through it. I've seen it all, and I'll be here next month when the absolute winter sets in to tell you what happens next. Until then, watch your rear view mirror and trust nothing. Good night.